Thank you, thank you. Okay, let me immediately, before touching anything else, put all rumors and false reports to rest. I never, repeat, never, have not now, nor have I ever been a date of Hillary Clinton's. This is not true. My wonderful wife of 29 years is here, and I knew Hillary, and she was a friend of mine. We were in the same first-year classes in law school. We actually did study together. The main distinction that I have regarding Secretary Clinton, and she can be asked about this in her book tour. In fact, it would be a way that it could be disrupted even further, was I actually did warn her against Bill Clinton, because but that was because I also knew him from before, but that is another story. We don't want to talk about that. I don't want to talk about that. And we're running on time here, and I know that members of Congress are going to be here as soon as they can. Governor Christie, they apparently had a little bit of difficulty because some bridges were closed. But sorry, couldn't resist. But isn't it great, frankly, to be here, to hear Chris Christie, and to hear Rand Paul, and to hear yesterday Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, to hear Michelle Bachmann, to hear all of the wonderful people we have on our side. You know, on the other side, you could be waiting in line at a book signing where they're not even allowing questions, right? What I wanted to speak to you about today is a need for a change in the culture, and a change for our mood that I hope will begin right now, this moment, at this conference, in this place. What am I talking about? I do a radio show, as Ralph mentioned, and I'm going to be running off as soon as I'm done here to do the radio show today, where our guests are going to include Governor Bobby Jindal and Arthur Brooks, who you heard from earlier, and Grover Norquist. Pretty good lineup. And I begin every single radio show by saying, and another great day in this greatest nation on God's green earth. And all the time I get emails and sometimes get callers who call in, and they say, why do you say it's the greatest nation on God's green earth? And also people say, why do you say it's another great day? What's so great about this day? The truth is, let me start first, it's a great day because we are Americans. Because we can make it a great day. This day can be anything we choose to shape with our own hands and our own will and our own energy and our own faith. And this is the greatest nation on God's green earth. I mean, I had somebody who wrote in yesterday, we had disagreement day. They wrote in, they said, well, why don't you say that Israel is the greatest nation on God's green earth? My brother made his life in Israel. He moved to Israel 23 years ago. He's raised his 4 children there. I'm very close to my brother. We, thank God, are privileged to be able to go to Israel usually at least once a year. But, you know, the truth is that part of what great means is something of size, of scope, of consequence. And there is no nation in all of history as consequential as the United States of America. Our nation has made more of a difference. In fact, there is a wonderful book, and it's a book by a historian at University of Pennsylvania, don't hold that against him, named Walter McDougall, and it's called Freedom Just Around the Corner. And he begins the book by saying the creation of the United States is the central event of the last 400 years of human history. And he asks a question. The question is, imagine that you could travel in time, which people dream about, and you were able to go back in time and gather some seasoned observer from 1600, some 414 years ago, and you were to bring him into the world today. There's a lot about our world that would stun him, technology and how many billions of people there were on the planet, but he wouldn't be so amazed at the array of civilizations that we have. There's a Chinese empire, huge and vast, with an authoritarian and corrupt bureaucracy. There's a Japan that is homogeneous and paranoid and inward-looking. There is a Russian empire that is amorphous, either pulsating inward or outward, depending on the will of the moment of Moscow. There is a Europe that is more or less Christian and aspiring to unity, but bitterly divided by differences in ideology and language and the rest of it. There is an Indian empire that is teeming. It's a multi-colored quilt made up of Hindus and Muslims trying to become a nation. And then there is an Iberian, Spanish, Amerindian culture in Latin America and South America that is largely impotent and poor. The only nation, the only continent that would surprise a time traveler from 400 years ago, from 1600, would be North America. Because North America at that time was underpopulated, almost desolate of human population, it was, with the only people who lived here being a Neolithic Stone Age cultures. No one would have predicted that the richest, the most dominant, the most prosperous, the most influential culture in all of human history would arise here. The question that polarizes Americans today, the question that divides the whole world, the question that will largely determine your success and failure, your course in life, is how do you explain the miracle of America? How do you explain the illogical fact that in North America, of all the continents, of all places on earth, this is where this civilization arose? And one of the reasons that the mood in our country is so sour, and that so many people coming up to this 4th of July, which is just a couple of weeks from now, one of the reasons that people coming up to this 4th of July are more likely to have a feeling of guilt rather than gratitude is we forget that it was the hand of God, manifest and unmistakable, that built this country. Because if we forget that, then there is only one plausible alternate explanation. Because look, if you're looking at a business or a sports team, everybody in America understands sports. And we live in Seattle, and I'm proud of our Seahawks. I am. And yeah, they won the Super Bowl. But they also lost 3 games in the course of the year. It is extraordinary, unheard of, for a team to win every season and every damn game and every time. People who play poker. And I know there's some people here who might give in to the temptation of playing poker occasionally. If you have a regular poker game, my brother actually hosts a regular Thursday night poker game in Jerusalem. And he enjoys it. But if he wouldn't enjoy it, if there was the same winner every single week, you'd begin to suspect something, that somebody was cheating. And that is the prevailing explanation that our kids get in our schools. You have to acknowledge that America has been unbelievably successful, that everything is broken right for America. It is implausible and absurd to say it's good luck. You can say you win 1 poker game from good luck, and 2, and 3, and 4, but if you win more than 250 years of poker consistently, well, then you're either cheating or there's some kind of supernatural cause to your winning. And that is why, because we have forgotten, because we have lost sight of divine providence in our history, in shaping our nation, in determining our destiny, what you hear is not an attempt to encourage gratitude, which is an appropriate emotion for being an American, but an attempt to encourage guilt. The only reason we succeeded is, you know the litany. Number 1, we committed genocide against Native Americans and we stole the land from them. Number 2, we enslaved people from Africa and built our wealth based upon their toil. And by the way, this is well dealt with in Dinesh D'Souza's new film that many of you saw last night. But one of the things that even Dinesh doesn't mention, and you need to know, the leading historian of American slavery is a guy at my alma mater at Yale named David Bryan Davis. And he has done the calculations based upon a lifetime of scholarship of what happened with the 12 million Africans who were imprisoned, enslaved, kidnapped, and sent elsewhere to be slaves. What percentage of them went to what later became America? It's less than 3%. Less than 3%. America was not uniquely guilty of the crime of slavery. America was uniquely creditworthy for the glory of ending the crime of slavery. And we sacrificed for it, and we fought for it, and we led for it. The point is that if you do not believe that America has been shaped by the hand of God, and that there has been an organized plan by a higher power to allow this country to succeed, you inevitably come to this sense that America cheated. We despoiled the continent. We raped Native Americans. We imposed our imperialist will on the rest of the world. I'll give you an example of this. I mentioned Walter McDougall's book, Freedom Just Around the Corner. There was a posting on the internet when this book came out. And one of the things that the poster said, and I think this is fairly hilarious, is your discussion is predicated on the idea that the United States is the central event of the last 400 years. Bit egocentric, don't you think? Obviously, the freedom to perpetuate genocide on the natives, to ruin a pristine continent, is freedom perverted to epic proportions. When one takes into account our human rights record, in quotes, of the last 50 years, and our status as the #1 arms dealer and resource glutton on the planet Earth, the very word freedom takes on sinister connotations. Well, if you have that view, if you are constantly looking down in the muck and looking down in the mire and ignoring the fact that our human rights record of the last 50 years has saved the world, our human rights record of the last 50 years includes the greatest victory in American history, which was the victory over international communism and the evil empire and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which no one could have predicted. No one could have predicted, except that Ronald Reagan did. And Ronald Reagan did so because he had faith in God's guiding hand on our country. Let me mention just a couple of things, stories that are worth recalling in passing and toward conclusion. Governor Christie, at the end of his fine remarks, and I applaud the governor for making such strong and dedicated and principled pro-life statements, one of the things he talked about at the end was a letter that John Adams wrote about his sacrifices, and he wrote it close to the 50th anniversary of the 4th of July. That 50th 4th of July was the most important 4th of July in American history. Why? Well, because people were unsure that this republic could last 50 years. We had tests. We had a naval war against France in which hundreds of Americans died. We had the War of 1812. Do you know 15,000 Americans died in the war of 1812? And in a country that was a fraction of what it is today, it would have a population of 12 million at the time. It was a bloody war, the second war for American independence. There was the beginnings of sectional conflict, not so much sexual conflicts at that time. We had the beginning of sectional conflict that later culminated in the war for the Union. And so 50 years was considered to be an epic event in America. And you know what? The President of the United States in 1826, when they celebrated that 50th 4th of July, was a guy named John Quincy Adams. He was the son of that same John Adams who had helped Jefferson write the Declaration. And guess what? We had the great privilege of having those two great patriots alive to see that day. Jefferson and Adams, the two people most responsible for the Declaration we celebrate on the 4th of July, both made a point. They were both very old, both in their 80s. Adams nearly 90. Jefferson in his early 80s, at a time when the average person lived into his 40s. It was an amazing thing, and the country was grateful for it. They invited Jefferson and Adams down to Washington for a grand celebration with President Adams, the son of John Adams, our second president. They couldn't make it because they were both old and infirm, but they were both determined to live to see that day. And before that day, Jefferson wrote a brilliant letter about the advance of liberty in the last 50 years. And the letter was read aloud at the 4th of July celebration. And the country was grateful, and they had church services in which people thanked God for the creation of the United States of America. And then what happened is Jefferson took ill. And he took ill on the eve of the 4th of July, and he was feverish at night. And he kept saying, "Is it the 4th? Is it the 4th?" He wanted to hang on and he died midday of the 4th of July at his mountaintop in Monticello. He died at midday of the 4th of July, exactly 50 years after his declaration. What are the chances? What are the chances? And meanwhile, in Braintree, Massachusetts, Adams took visitors who came to honor him on the 4th of July. And then in the evening, he wanted to be taken up to the upstairs bedroom so he could see fireworks from the window and he could hear the signs of celebration in town. And he saw that, and he saw that with gratitude. And then he took to his bed, and his last words were, "Liberty is safe, Jefferson still lives." They died on the same day. That day was July 4th. That day was exactly 50 years after their declaration. No one in America at that time was so callous, so cynical, they thought, oh, this is a coincidence. By the way, you want to calculate coincidences? Okay, the idea that you die on the 4th of July, the odds against that are huge. The idea that two guys die on the 4th of July, that's huge. 4th of July, same year, even bigger odds. And the 4th of July, exactly 50 years after the declaration that John Adams was anticipating. It's an amazing thing. People saw it at the time as a confirmation of God's will, even in our own time. Even in our own time. I mentioned President Reagan briefly before. On March 30th, 1981, President Reagan had just become president. He was beginning to turn our country around from another dark period in our history. President Reagan was coming out of the Washington Hilton Hotel when a crazy guy, inspired partially by Hollywood, but that's another story, a crazy guy named Hinckley shot the president. The bullet came to within 1/4 of an inch of his heart. He was an old man. He was 70 years old. I know that's not old today, but President Reagan was, at the time, our oldest president. Newly elected oldest president. And President Reagan survived. 6 weeks later, another old man, grievously shot by an assassin, wounded in 3 places, a bullet 1/4 of an inch away from vital organs. His name was John Paul II. He also lived. What was the message? 2 men targeted for death, barely surviving. The answer is God needed them. It was part of a plan. Understanding God's hand on America is something that we need to begin to do. If we are going to choose a happy heart, an uplifted spirit, then we have to understand that what we should feel for all of the blessings that are showered upon us, I mean, so prodigiously, so irrationally, so disproportionately. My God, look around the world today. Put this world in context. We could be in Somalia. We could be in Kenya, where they are killing Christians, murdering Christians. Recently, this terrorist attack on a resort, they came to the door of people and they said, "Are you a Christian?" And if you were a Christian, they killed you because you weren't Muslim. This is going on all over the world. They have riots. The American flag was being burned in Brazil to protest the World Cup. Look, you can blame America for a lot, but don't blame us for soccer. Yeah. Really. You can blame us for baseball or football, but not for soccer. They're burning the American flag in Brazil. Basically basket cases around the world. Europe, there are Russian tanks in Ukraine. I thank God every morning, and this is not an exaggeration, it's real. In Jewish tradition, you begin the day not by saying, "Oh God, why did you give me another day to struggle and feel pain and feel sorry for myself?" You begin the day by saying, "Modeh ani lifonecha melachai v'kayom." I thank you, God, O ever-living King, for this new day and what I can do with it. And I thank God that my grandfather had the tremendous good sense and foresight in 1910 to leave behind the charnel house that is known as Ukraine and to make his way to Philadelphia and to work for years as a barrel maker until his hands couldn't move anymore because of the splinters in his hands, so that my father could get an education. And that's the American way. And I thank God even more that my mother, with her family, left Germany in 1934. Believe me, a very good time to leave Germany. But any time is a good time to leave another country and come to the United States of America, because this country is blessed. and we will stop with the guilt if we recognize that our blessings come from God, not because we cheated, not because we don't deserve them, it's because God wills it. And if we choose the alternative to guilt, which is not pride or arrogance, it's gratitude. The problem with America and the problem with our schools and the problem with so much of us is we have forgotten to whom gratitude is due. You know, I know in some schools they say Thanksgiving is a day to remember all of America's crimes against Native Americans. Other schools they say Thanksgiving is a day when you thank Native Americans. Thanksgiving is a day when you thank God. Unless you know to whom thanks are due, you cannot be properly grateful. Unless you are properly grateful, you cannot be a success, not in business, not in politics, not in media. Because you know what? In politics, there are a lot of people over the years who have claimed the title happy warrior. President Reagan was a happy warrior. You remember President Reagan as a gloomy Gus? Somebody who looked downcast, told about how terrible things were. No, President Reagan won the country because of his optimism. There were Democrats who claimed to be happy warriors, Al Smith and Hubert Humphrey and others of different quality. But you know what? Nobody claims to be the depressed warrior, the grumpy warrior. And now I introduce to you Hillary Clinton, the grumpy warrior. Listen, this is why and how we can win. Yes, we've got a lot of problems in this country. Yes, we've got a lot of challenges, but let us not forget that we are a people entangled with a divine purpose. And let me conclude with this, and I do this because this is something that the Jewish people in particular are asked to keep in mind. We count every day of the week based upon the relation to Shabbat, to the Sabbath. The Sabbath is coming this evening. My wife Diane is going to be speaking later today, but my wife Diane and I are very honored, we're very privileged that we're going to be spending this Sabbath with our good friends at the Faith and Freedom Coalition. And we're honored that Ralph and everyone else involved has made it easy for us to be Sabbath observers. But the great point about Shabbat is context, is seeing the week and seeing the world in the proper context. Understanding the reason that you observe Shabbat is not to have a day where you are changing the world. The Bible says you should work for 6 days, and it's the kind of work, there are different words for work in Hebrew, the kind of work that you do during the week that is prohibited on Shabbat is called malacha, which means creative work, world-changing work. We're supposed to change the world, but one day a week, you kick back and you realize this is a beautiful world. This is a beautiful country that God has created. Let us keep that context. And as we come into this Shabbat, let us remember the all-important difference between the urgent, because we live our lives with the tyranny of the urgent, and the important. Not everything that is urgent is truly important, and not everything that is truly important is actually urgent. Some of it is timeless, like the timeless truth that God has blessed America. We should feel eternally grateful for that and strive, as people in this audience always do, to be worthy of that blessing. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. God bless America, and God bless the Faith and Freedom Coalition, and Shabbat Shalom, Sabbath peace to everyone.